Hi. In this talk, we're taking intercultural communication out of the obvious settings, the countries, languages, formal cultural encounters, and we're going to put it somewhere much closer to home, which is relationships. So, the relationships we have with people we see regularly, like roommates and classmates and coworkers and partners and family, places where the same folks keep interacting, keep accumulating history, keep bringing different cultural expectations into contact with each other. The key idea here is that relationships are shaped by learned expectations, and learned expectations are cultural. So when a relationship feels confusing or tense, or like you keep having the same argument, it's often not random and not purely personality. It's two expectation systems interacting without anyone having named them yet. So, our goal is to learn how to see those systems and to have a framework for understanding what's actually happening when things feel off. Before we go further, let's think about what we mean by intercultural relationship because it's broader than most of us initially think. It does include relationships that cross national or ethnic lines, but it also includes relationships shaped by differences in religion and generation, and class background, and regional culture, and family structure, and the cultures of disability and neurodivergence, and gender and sexual identity. So, two people can grow up in the same city, speak the same first language, and still bring strikingly different cultural assumptions about what relationships are for, how closeness is expressed, how conflict is handled, what it means to show up for someone. And this matters because we sometimes assume this doesn't apply to us if we're not in what we picture as a cross cultural relationship. It almost certainly does apply. The question is just which cultural differences are active in our specific relationships. Cultural identity in a relationship isn't static. It's not something that we carry in separately and then set down. It's active. It gets expressed and tested and affirmed, and sometimes quietly suppressed in the texture of daily interaction, in how we greet each other, in what we laugh about, in how we handle tension, what we're willing to say out loud versus what we leave implied. So, intercultural scholar Mary Jane Collier describes this as identity avowal and identity ascription. Avowals the cultural identity we claim for ourselves, so how we see ourselves and present ourselves. Ascription is the identity others assign to us, so how they read and respond to us. In relationships, both of these are happening constantly. So, who we are in a relationship is partly answered by how the other person sees us. And when a relationship reflects our cultural identity back accurately and affirmingly, it's sustaining something really important. And when it consistently misreads or minimizes or ignores parts of who we are, that has a cost even if the relationship is otherwise caring and functional. And this is worth sitting with just for a minute. So we can be in a genuinely good relationship, but still experience a slow erosion of parts of our identity if those parts are regularly unseen or treated as the different way of doing things. One of the more interesting things that happens in long term intercultural relationships is that they develop their own microculture. Researchers who study intercultural couples and deep friendships describe this as third culture formation. It's a set of shared preferences and rituals and communication norms and inside understandings. And these belong specifically to the two people in the relationship. Neither person brought it in fully formed, It emerged from sustained negotiation between their different cultural worlds. And this process can be genuinely enriching. So, people in intercultural relationships often describe expanded perspectives and new ways of questioning their own assumptions and a flexibility that develops from regularly navigating cultural difference. And that's real, and it's worth naming as part of the full picture because we're going to spend time on where things can go wrong, and it's important not to reduce intercultural relationships to just a problem set. That said, third cultural formation is also where deeper tensions can emerge. So, building shared meaning requires negotiation. Not all negotiations start from equal footing. People in intercultural relationships and people whose cultural identity differs from the culture around them often become skilled at moving between cultural registers. The term code switching originally referred to shifting between languages or dialects, but it's widely used now to describe the broader practice of adjusting communication style and behavior and self presentation depending on cultural context. The code switching is a real skill. It reflects cultural intelligence and adaptability, but it also carries a cost that is unevenly distributed. When one person in a relationship is consistently the one code switching, consistently the one modifying their style, managing how much of their cultural identity to show, monitoring how they're being read, that asymmetry, it matters. It's tiring in ways that are difficult to articulate, and it rarely shows up as the obvious source of tension when tension eventually appears. It just becomes background fatigue. And one of the questions worth asking in any relationship is who is doing most of the adjusting? And has that ever been discussed, or did it just become the pattern? When we say culture, we mean something broader than nationality or ethnicity. We mean the learned rules that govern how relationships are supposed to work. So people absorb these rules early from family, from the communities they grew up in, from peer groups, and prior relationships. So, rules about how fast to reply, how directly to speak, how to show care, how to handle tension, and what counts as responsible and what counts as caring. Because these rules are learned early and reinforced constantly, they come to feel natural, normal. And when something feels natural, we tend to assume it's obvious that anyone reasonable would operate the same way. But that assumption is where a lot of relational friction starts. Not because anyone is wrong, but because obvious is learned. It's not universal. We've all been in relationships. We all have this experience. So most relationship tension doesn't come from major events. It comes from small, repeated moments. So short replies, delayed responses, tone differences, not following through on something. People would say something like, it's such a little thing, but why does it feel so significant, so big? And that reaction is actually useful data. Small moments feel big when they connect to expectations. So, one short reply, that's not the issue. It's the pattern of short replies. And what makes it feel big isn't just the behavior, it's the meaning that we attach to the behavior. We say things to ourselves like they don't care, or they're always like this, or that's who they are. So the behavior itself may be small, but the story that we build around those behaviors, that's not. One of the most useful tools is separating behavior from meaning, and behavior is what actually happened. Meaning is the interpretation we attach to it. Short reply is behavior. They're annoyed with me is meaning. Didn't text back for 3 hours is behavior. They don't prioritize this relationship is meaning. We move between those two levels almost instantly, so fast that we don't notice the jump most of the time. Intercultural competence becomes including noticing that gap and holding the interpretation a little more loosely before locking it in. And this isn't about being naive or dismissing your instincts. It's about recognizing that there's usually more than one explanation for any given behavior, and the explanation that comes fastest is usually the one most shaped by our own cultural expectations. Edward T. Hall's work on high context and low context communication is relevant here. Some communication styles are more direct. Meaning is stated explicitly, clarity is seen as respect. Others are more indirect. Meaning is carried through tone and timing and context. What's left unsaid because shared understanding is assumed. So when these styles interact, each side often misjudges the other. So direct feels blunt or aggressive to someone used to indirect. Indirect feels unclear or evasive to someone used to direct. Neither is communicating poorly. They're communicating through different systems. The mistake is assuming your system is the default and reading the other person's system as a failure to communicate properly. And this comes up constantly in digital communication where tone is already stripped down and the interpretation gap widens fast. We've all been here. Seen, thumbs up, K. So these signals don't contain much explicit information, which means our expectations do most of the interpretive work. One person is going to read efficiency and another reads dismissal. One person reads message received, we're good. Another reads, I cannot be bothered to actually respond to you. Digital communication amplifies this because tone and facial expression and context, these are all reduced. So the less information a signal carries, the more the receiver fills in. And what they fill in comes from their own cultural expectations about what responsiveness or care or effort are supposed to look like. And when expectations are not shared, a thumbs up can end a friendship. It sounds like an exaggeration, but it isn't. Here is one of the most important ideas that we'll cover. Expectations often feel like facts. If you care about someone, you respond quickly. If you're responsible, you finish the task before you relax. If something is bothering you, you say so. These feel like obvious truths, but they're learned rules. They come from specific cultural and family contexts, and they vary considerably across different communities and backgrounds. The problem is not having expectations. Everyone has them. The problem is treating our expectations as universal when they're not. Intercultural awareness makes those expectations visible so they can be discussed rather than assumed. So, why didn't you respond immediately can become, in my family, that's how we showed we cared. What does it mean in yours? For our purposes, conflict means a perceived difference in needs, in expectations, in values, in goals. That's the definition. It's worth looking at because it's considerably broader than what people picture most when they hear the word conflict. Conflict does not require raised voices. It does not require argument or emotion or confrontation. It can exist calmly, quietly, politely, while everyone continues to be perfectly pleasant to each other. Two people can be in active conflict and still be functionally cooperative and outwardly fine. And this matters because a lot of relational conflict goes unaddressed, not because it's not real, but because it doesn't look like conflict from the outside. If your definition of conflict requires a fight, you're not going to name it until it's already escalated. Seeing it early when it's just a difference in expectations gives you options. Let's cover like a quick example. So, two people working on a shared project, and one prefers to do frequent check ins and updates. They want to stay connected. That feels like collaboration. The other really wants to work independently and only report back when tasks get done. And that's what respect for their process looks like to that person. So no argument happens and the work gets done. But one person feels like they're being kept in the dark, and the other feels like they're being micromanaged. And both feel like a low level frustration they can't quite put a name to. And that is conflict, not because of emotion or confrontation, because expectations about how you collaborate, that doesn't match. And because no one has named it, it keeps generating the same, like, quiet friction on the project. In long-term relationships, cultural identity, it's not static. It gets negotiated over time and often without anyone even realizing the negotiation is happening. So small moments are going to establish precedent. Whose comfort gets prioritized when there's a conflict of comfort? Whose communication style becomes the default? What gets labeled a big deal and what gets treated as something to move past. And by the time that the pattern is visible, it's usually already a well-worn groove. And this matters because identity salience, so how prominently your cultural identity figures in your daily experience, that can actually increase over time in a relationship, not decrease. So people sometimes assume familiarity smooths cultural difference away, and in some ways it does, but it also raises the stakes. So the longer a relationship continues, the more specific and consequential the cultural negotiations become, especially around major life transitions like moving in together, having children, dealing with illness, or navigating family obligations. There's an important distinction between adaptation and suppression. It can be easy to miss. So, adaptation is mutual. Both people genuinely expand and change, and both cultural worlds get brought forward and integrated into something new. And that's the third culture formation we talked about earlier, and it's a good thing. Suppression is different. It's when parts of one person's cultural identity gradually go quiet, not because they've been resolved or integrated, but because expressing them has created friction or because the other person's expectations have become the de facto standard. And the person experiencing this often doesn't notice it. They don't notice it clearly until they're somewhere else, like visiting family or with their own community or in a moment of reflection. And they feel that contrast. And the question worth asking is the adaptation in your relationships mutual? Or has one person's cultural world been contracting while the other stays centered? So is one shrinking while the other one takes center stage? Or are you working to negotiate, navigate, and include both? Single moments, these are flexible. We can explain them away, we can give benefit of the doubt, we can move on. Patterns, these are more powerful. So they create a story, and once that story forms, new behavior gets interpreted through it. That always happens. They never, every time I. So phrases like that, these are signals that pattern recognition has begun. The specific incident matters less at that point than what it confirms about an established narrative. Intercultural communication helps here because it offers an alternative narrative instead of they always do this because they don't care. It makes space for this keeps happening because our expectations about this specific thing, they don't match, but neither of us has named or negotiated that yet. Escalation usually starts internally. From the outside, everything looks normal, conversations continue, tasks get done, messages get exchanged. But internally, reactions get stronger with each repeated misunderstanding. And the turning point is when people start reacting to the expected pattern instead of the actual behavior in front of them. A delayed reply stops being a delayed reply and becomes evidence. A short response stops being a short response and becomes confirmation of something. And this is when small differences start doing disproportionate emotional work. Escalation will show up indirectly in withdrawal, in overcorrection, in sudden bluntness, in reacting strongly to relatively small triggers. And these aren't signs of overreaction, they're signs that unresolved interpretation has been accumulating in the background for a while. Attribution is how we explain the causes of behavior, our own and other people's. We discussed this earlier, and it comes back here because it is central to how conflict develops in relationships. We tend to explain our own behavior situationally. I didn't respond because I was slammed at work, for example. We tend to explain other people's behavior as personality. They never respond because they're inconsiderate. Same behavior, different attribution logic. And in close relationships, this pattern operates more quietly. Over time, situational explanations for the other person's behavior gets replaced by character explanations. And once that shift happens, the same behavior carries a much heavier emotional charge. Not all cultural differences carry the same weight in a relationship. Some expectations feel negotiable. Others quietly become the rules everyone operates by, and that difference is often about power. Power in relationships doesn't only come from formal authority, it can come from things like age and experience and economic dependence and language fluency and whose cultural norms align most closely with the mainstream social expectations. When one person's communication style matches the broader cultural default, their norms tend to go unexamined. The other person's style gets labeled as the different one, more emotional, less professional, too indirect, too intense. This shapes who adapts more, who is called difficult for holding a boundary, whose discomfort gets taken seriously. These are not small questions, and they affect whether both people's identities are actually being sustained in the relationship or whether one person is slowly becoming invisible. Hofstede's work on cultural value dimensions, it helps us explain why people can disagree so consistently about things that seem on the surface to be straightforward. So things like what counts as done or complete, what counts as respectful, what counts as caring and responsible and attentive, and these vary by cultural value system. In some systems, anticipating needs is care. In others, responding when asked is care, and anticipating is overreach. In some systems, task completion comes first, and in others, relationship maintenance comes first, and the task waits. When these values meet in a relationship, each person genuinely feels the other's doing it wrong, not because one of them is, but because they're evaluating the same situation through different learned frameworks. So Hofstede gives us language for those frameworks. When something goes sideways in a relationship, how people handle it, called the repair process, that's shaped itself by cultural expectations. Some people expect direct conversation as soon as the problem surfaces, but others expect to have some time and some space or indirect signals before any discussion begins. Some approach repair as a problem to be solved efficiently. Others approach it as a relational moment that needs to be handled carefully. And when these expectations differ, attempts at repair can themselves become sources of tension. One person feels ignored because the other hasn't addressed it directly, and the other feels pressured because the first person brought it up too soon. So, good intentions, they don't automatically produce smooth repair because repair Two, requires shared expectations about how it's supposed to work. Recognizing that is one of the more practically useful things we can do in intercultural communication. Intercultural competence is not a permanent state that we achieve. It's a practice and it's ongoing and it's uneven. And we usually notice patterns after the moment has passed. We think about what we might have said differently. We revise our interpretations. We try again. In real relationships, that looks like slowing interpretation before locking it in, naming expectations rather than assuming them, separating behavior from character and asking what else might explain this before settling on the first explanation that arrives. None of this requires perfect cultural knowledge or constant self monitoring. It mostly requires one habit: noticing when you've moved from what happened to what it means and pausing there long enough to consider whether another explanation might fit. We're going to end with a story that sounds trivial, but isn't. Two people share a kitchen. One of them unloads the dishwasher as soon as it finishes. The other lets the clean dishes sit for hours, sometimes overnight. The first person interprets this as laziness. The second interprets the urgency as unnecessary intensity. Nobody argues about it. Nobody says anything. But every time the dishes sit, one person is quietly annoyed. And every time the dishwasher is unloaded immediately, the other feels silently judged. Eventually, one asks, "Why do you always rush the dishes?" And the answer isn't because I'm right. The answer is because where I grew up, leaving clean dishes sitting meant you weren't done with your responsibilities that yet, so you couldn't do something else until that was done. So suddenly the dishwasher, that's no longer about dishes. It's about timing and responsibility and what being done means. And so nothing magical happens after that conversation. They probably still disagree about the dishwasher, but the irritation shifts. The behavior becomes more understandable, which is different from excused, different from resolved, but it's meaningfully different from mysterious. And that's what this is about. Not eliminating difference, but making difference make more sense. Thanks for joining me on this talk of intercultural communication and conflict, and I hope you have a great day with tons of insights.